Who was Fantaisie? Fantaisie was a slave who escaped the Desbassayns family in Paris in 1823. He belonged to the powerful widow, Ombline Gonneau-Montbrun, Madame Desbassayns. The widow selected Fantaisie, age 18, to accompany her grandson, Eugène, 21, on the long ocean voyage from Bourbon to Paris. Though born on the African mainland, Fantaisie must have learned the French language, customs, and the skills of a valet from a fairly early age. Why then is Fantaisie's name missing from the widow's census records? There are several possible explanations. She might have rechristened one of her slaves Fantaisie just as he departed for France. Colonial masters could assign names to their slaves at whim. Another hypothesis is that Madame Desbassayns, like many other wealthy planters, neglected to declare Fantaisie on her census returns because she purchased him illegally. Perhaps Fantaisie had been smuggled into the colony from the East African mainland following the slave trade ban issued by the British in 1811. Finally, the widow might have purchased Fantaisie from another colonial family, close to Eugène's departure, without ever listing him on her census declaration. Archival documents often omit key information, forcing us to interpret these absences. How did Fantaisie arrive in Paris? According to the law, when Fantaisie and Eugène arrived in Le Havre in 1821, Eugène should have placed Fantaisie in a holding cell known as the Dépôt des Noirs to await his prompt return to Bourbon. Instead, over the objections of the port official, Eugène brought Fantaisie to serve him at the family mansion in Paris at 10 Rue Pigalle. When Eugène's parents, Philippe Panon Desbassayns de Richemont and Eglé Mourgue, arrived in 1823, Fantaisie found the conditions unbearable. He escaped across the city to 65 Rue Saint-Nicolas, home of one François, homme de couleur et musicien. Outraged, the Baroness petitioned the prefect of Paris to arrest her family's fugitive slave. Eventually, the prefect responded to the Baroness with regret that, after careful consideration of the case by the King's Council, he must inform her that his hands were tied. The prefect could not order Fantaisie's arrest without due cause under metropolitan law. Je n'ai d'autre moyen que d'exercer sur lui une surveillance sévère, et même de le faire mander à ma préfecture pour lui demander la représentation de ses papiers. Il faudrait qu'il se fût rendu coupable de quelque délit, ou qu'il fût en état de vagabondage, et dans ce cas, il devrait être mis immédiatement à la disposition de l'autorité judiciaire pour être jugé conformément à la loi qui, dans l'application des peines, n'admet aucune distinction d'origine. In other words, Fantaisie had effectively achieved his de facto freedom from the Desbassayns under metropolitan law. What were the effects of Fantaisie's escape? The Fantaisie affair prompted the ministry to change its policy in 1824. It issued a ban on the exit of slaves from any colony, whether for France or any other destination. This ban remained in effect until 1830, when the July monarchy resumed its policy of allowing slaves who escaped their masters in the metropole to become de facto free. 6 years later, Louis-Philippe ratified the Chamber of Deputies' Free Soil Ordinance, officially recognizing all people who arrived in metropolitan France as free. What became of Fantaisie? Ironically, once Fantaisie escaped the Desbassayns family and the surveillance of the French state, he disappears from the archives. Today we can only imagine him listening to the music of François, searching for a position as a valet, waiting for spring to return to the cold, gray city of Paris.